The alchemy, as far as kosher winemaking, is very complex and it's very interesting. The fact is that you have the different varieties of different wines, and you find that it's not only the actual each wine in itself; it's where it's grown. Like we have some Argentinian wines here, and we have some that come from France, and they come from all over the world, Australia, and we see that there are different nuances in flavor and actual in the wine itself. And this is because the actual where it's grown is from the earth, which is a very fascinating subject in itself. But what's so fascinating? What about kosher? Let's go back to the basics. What is kosher wine involved? How do we get involved, or what does it do in the process? So there are very strict regulations that have to be followed. It all begins from the fields. So as the grapes are harvested from the fields and they're brought into the presses, the wines themselves have to be, as I mentioned before, has to be all pressed by religious individuals. Another part of this, another interesting aspect of it, which people don't realize, that this past year we had what we call shvi, or we call shmita year. And the shmita year meant that all the land in Eretz Israel had to be laid fallow. It was not to be used or cultivated or anything the nature of that sort. So therefore, what about the grapes and the wines that came from those fields? So what is the issue? Are we allowed to drink from those wines? So basically, they have to be handled very differently. There's a special kedusha, a special holiness to those grapes that come from those fields. And therefore, a lot of rabbinic organizations will not either certify it because the restrictions that are involved in actual handling of those grapes and those making the wine using those grapes. And therefore, that's why it's another reason why you may not find that you won't find so many wines from this coming year that have the kosher stamp on it. And if they do, they've been treated in a very special way, and they have to be, not only that, but they have to be drank, the wines have to be finished by a certain period of time. So there's a lot of different restrictions in that respect as far as the wines that are coming from this past year. So there's a loophole which has been used by a number of different Israeli wines, and some of the rabbis have sanctioned this, is the fact that they sell the property, they sell the land. What they do is they sell the land to the Arab, and now it belongs to the Arabs, and therefore it's not Jewish owned anymore, so I can use those grapes from those to make that wine. This is according to the majority of the rabbinic leaders in Israel, that this is not acceptable, and it's only acceptable where there's a real hardship and loss of money, where we're talking about droughts and things of that nature, and therefore a lot of the rabbis do not sanction that. So once the wines are made and they're done with the experienced winemakers like we have in Israel, but if they are not observant, they cannot touch the wines. They're not allowed to handle it. And during the kosher production, they're also not allowed to use any. There's also ingredients that are commonly used in the actual production, and that's people they don't realize that they also affect the kosherness of the wine. First of all, in order to get a purity or clarity in wine, there's gelatin, or there could be isinglass. Gelatin comes from could come from animal sources, either from animal bones or from pig fat. Pig bones or pig hides, and also could come from kosher animals as well. But again, it has to be kosher slaughtered animal. It's not enough that it's a kosher species. But then, so gelatin itself is a problem, and also sometimes they use egg whites, and which also is difficult. It's a problem because the eggs have to come from they have no blood spots and other issues of that nature. But usually the kosher wines don't have these issues. Isinglass comes from the gallbladder of a sturgeon. Now the purpose of these ingredients, what they do is they clarify the wine. They bring the pectins together. They use this in apple juice as well. They use it in beer. Any kind of those beverages where you want to get a very clear. Thank you. You want a very clear perspective, so it doesn't look very fuzzy in the water. That the easy way to see this, if you take fresh apple juice, the apple juice itself is if you see fresh apple juice, you see it has very cloudy. In order to get rid of those pectins or those things that are floating around in there, they add this gelatin. The gelatin itself, what it does is causes it to precipitate and causes it to come together, and therefore they're easy to filter out. Also, wines, there's another aspect of it that people aren't aware of it. Was that wines they add or inoculate, they can take grape juice and they actually use wine yeast from different wineries in order to make different types of wines. So those wine yeasts also have to be kosher because we have to know where they're coming from. Are they coming from kosher wineries, or are they coming from different, who's providing them, who's actually using them to ferment the wines in order to make these wines. There's also another problem with Israeli wines, is when we talked about the shvis, when we talked about the shmita, where there's trumas and maestras. That means that there's a certain tip that has to be given from the crops of those lands owned by the Jews, and there has to be a certain, like 10% that was paid off with that. That has to be taken off from the crops in order to make it permissible for, this is during the year when there's not a shmita year like this coming year, and many of those kosher wineries have to follow those restrictions as well. Now, there's also there's like two levels of kosher wines. There's one somebody asked me about. We're talking about there's Mevushal, and there's also non-Mevushal. You see this commonly used in the restaurants and any COR functions, as far as kosher functions are concerned. We always use a non-Mevushal wine. I'm sorry, a Mevushal wine. And the reason why it has to be Mevushal means that it has been pasteurized. It goes back to historically that the Talmud also relates to us that the pagan wines, or the ones that are used by the non-Jews, they would never use a wine that was cooked, because that sort of made it inferior. That sort of brought it down a level, that it wasn't the same quality as the actual wines that were not cooked. So therefore, anything that's mevushal, so anything that's cooked, already falls out of that category, now can be handled by the non-Jews. So a lot of the processing that's involved is a lot of the wineries, in order to make it easier for them to process the wine grape juice, what they do is they'll pasteurize it right away before the actual handling. In other words, after the grape has been expressed, and then they can pasteurize it, then they can be handled by non-Jews, then there's no problem.